Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome. This is the Have You Heard podcast. This is episode number 12, and tonight we're going to start our show with what's happening on our farms, and then we're going to discuss the Western Kentucky 2021 Tornado Resiliency Project, a set of interviews that Josh and I are conducting currently and going through the Farm Machinery Show next week. I'm Morgan Hayes. I'm an assistant professor in Biosystems and Ag Engineering at the University of Kentucky, focusing on livestock facilities. And I also farm in Boyle County, about 500 acres with my husband, where we focus on a commercial cattle herd and hay sales.
I'm Josh Jackson, assistant professor in Biosystems and Agriculture Engineering, focused on precision livestock farming. And I farm in Mercer County, and we raise registered Angus cattle and do some hay production.
So it's good to have you here today, Josh.
Yep, it's good to be here.
And why don't we get started with what's happening on the farms this week? Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you're doing on the farm this week?
So this past week, we were fairly busy this weekend. Put out a lot of hay still, so that takes some time. But still try to work on some equipment. So we worked on the flail mower this time around. So we took probably about 44 of the flails off the conditioner. So some are looking a little rough, some aren't. And also repaired one of our fuel tanks, had a mobile fuel tank. Repaired that. Had to do a lot of work on that one, and just also had some feed delivered. So we have a creep feeder. We had feed delivered late last week, but by the time it was delivered, the ground had thawed out. So we have it. It's on site, so it's in a creep feeder. But we're waiting until probably this Friday when the ground hopefully solid becomes a little more solid to actually go out there and deliver or put it in the field.
Yeah, it makes sense. The ground has been fairly wet this week, and it's not drying out very quickly for anyone who is not from here. It's been a frustrating week in that regard. And on our farm this week, we've been feeding hay as well. That takes a little bit of time. We were doing a bunch of prep work before it got quite so soft when it was still frozen ground. And then other things we're doing is my husband has been traveling. I've mentioned that over the last couple weeks. So we were prepping for me to be able to feed and also work my job and do the other things I need to do. So that took a little bit of time over the weekend. We also had a feed delivery specifically for the feed that we feed to our weaned calves, which is typical that we were expecting to have one delivered here right around the beginning of February, and it was delivered then. And aside from that, we also had a fuel delivery. So you mentioned working on your fuel tank, but we actually purchased a pretty significant portion of our spring fuel needs so that we won't have to buy diesel in a month or two. Prices look like they're going up right now. So
it's definitely going to be a challenge, I think, this year, just from inputs. Inputs are definitely going to be a challenge. And I've been watching Ag Day every day, and it's just inputs are going to be an issue this year.
Yeah, it's going to be very expensive. And so sort of figuring out when to purchase and how much to purchase is going to be a challenge. And maybe as we get a little further into spring, we'll talk about fertilizer and hay and those strategies as well. But for us, getting some fuel earlier in the year was a strategy, and hopefully that pays off. And we didn't overpay for that fuel, but I don't see the prices coming back down in the near future. So we went ahead and bit the bullet, so to speak.
They're probably definitely not. I'd put my money on. They're definitely not coming down anytime soon.
Neither Josh nor I are willing to take a bet if you think fuel prices are coming down at this point. Other things to talk about today are the Western Kentucky Tornado Resiliency Project. So I just maybe a little bit of background for anyone who doesn't know. National Farm Machinery Show is a large show in Louisville. And our booth this year, we had Matt Dixon on earlier this year. He kind of maybe made some suggestions to this. Our booth is focused on the tornadoes in Western Kentucky that occurred December 10th and 11th, and the damage that they did. And so we're focusing on tornado resiliency, some of the emergency preparedness, some of the things that people would maybe want to consider moving forward. And as part of that, we have partnered with the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History here at University of Kentucky, and we're doing some interviews with leaders in the state, not necessarily folks who have been impacted directly by it, because some of them still have some trauma and aren't prepared to talk about it. But we're going to do some interviews with leaders who have been handling the initial responses, have been assessing some of those initial impacts. I think they're really going to be a great set of interviews that are going to be available through the Nunn Center, and possibly some of them posted here on our website as well, on our YouTube page as well. But our goal with all of this is really to provide some history and some perspective on how people are handling it from a leadership role. And those who actually want to call in and tell their personal stories, we will have a phone number that you'll be able to call in if you personally wanted to share your story, and allow the Louis B. Nunn Center to archive that for history so that people can really study it in the future.
Yeah, we talked with Ryan Quarles earlier this week, and it was eye-opening and almost mind-boggling just how much this impacted the state. Because you heard about it on the news, you saw it on the news, and we've seen it on the news, but it's just getting his perspective, how much, it decimated the poultry houses down there, how much it decimated just the entire, the granaries down there, just the ag impact. The ag was number one industry impacted by this tornado outbreak. And it wasn't just like it was one county. It went from all the way down West Kentucky, across the state through Boyle County. So it was definitely something that was a large impact. And I think it's, it's important, like you said, just for us is to try to keep that light on there, because there's still need for help down there.
Absolutely. It's going to take a very long time to get through all of the repairs and the things needed to really be resilient and to bounce back from this. And ag in particular, because it's so broad, it's such a wide swath of the state, making sure that all that work that needs to get done happens everywhere is going to be a long process. I know you mentioned that it was important to you because it needs such a light on it, especially for agriculture. And for me, it's pretty personal as well. You
survived a tornado.
We did. We had a tornado hit our farm in 2018, and that was a trying experience. In some ways, we were very lucky. It was a much smaller tornado, not a larger outbreak like this. The amount of damage broadly across the county was much less, and across the state, obviously, much less. But from a personal standpoint, it's extremely stressful, frustrating. I use the terminology. It feels like you're treading water and you're not getting ahead.
Because if I recall correctly, it took out some of your hay barns. It took out some of your hoop barns. You had probably two or three one had to be completely repaired, I think, or it took the tarp off, and another one just shifted the base, I think, a little bit. And
yeah, it was an April tornado, so we didn't have as much hay in our barns at that point in the year. It wasn't like as early in the year as these tornadoes were. And it damaged 3 of our 4 hoop barns in one site. It took off part of a roof on a dairy barn, which is where we now, and at that point were as well, feeding some weaned calves. It totally destroyed. We ended up totaling out a house on the farm that we were using for rental, but we're planning to move into when we worked on the other house that was on the farm. And the second house that we knew had already some issues that was going to have to be worked on in the future took enough damage that we ended up abandoning that house as well. So we ended up losing one house due to the tornado, and another one we ended up abandoning and purchasing a house off farm. Just from a practical standpoint, that was our best option at that point.
Yeah, because at some point the damage is just so great, because it took off the roof of the one, damaged, almost, the house was in need of some repairs, but it was damaged at kind of to the point where you're like, it's a loss, essentially.
Yeah, it was easier to call it a loss than to try and deal with the damage. We ended up, fortunately having family nearby that we were able to live with for 6 or 8 weeks while we repaired the damage on the house that wasn't actually destroyed, in order to be able to get back into it for the short term until we were able to move into a new house. But the whole process, took quite a while. It's one of those things that I don't know if people who aren't in ag understand, is that when the tornado happens and people lose their homes, the people that rented from us were able to move into a hotel until they could find a new rental.
Right.
And that's not to dismiss how stressful that was for them. I mean, they were very lucky. They had insurance. They had rental insurance. The company was very good to work with them. And they were able to find another rental because it wasn't a huge outbreak and there are still rentals in the area. They weren't, fixed as much on that scenario as
kind of you were, because you also had, I think, you saw some of the benefits of the high tensile at that point, the high tensile electric fence for your alpacas, for your, at that initial, when it hit, it took down your barns, took down the house, but then it also set the roof, I think, on the fence, in essence, didn't it?
Yeah, so the thing about the way that the tornadoes work is if you're on the farm, you can't really go away. It's not really feasible for you to go move into a hotel. The hotel isn't close enough to handle all the other things that you need to handle on the farm. And I don't want to speak for people that are just losing a house and not losing a bunch of other facilities or structures on the farm. But when you're trying to deal with insurance for the house and insurance for the farm, and you want to deal with all of these structures getting rebuilt, and there's different groups you're using to do all of this repair work, you literally have to be on the farm. And you would need to anyway to feed the animals, but you really need to be on the farm to manage all of these concerns. And fencing is one of those ones that I think we're seeing with the outbreak, how important getting the fencing back up quickly is.
Yep.
We were really lucky that we didn't have more debris. Most of our debris actually landed on our property, so we didn't have neighbors that were dealing with our debris. It was mainly us dealing with our own debris. But we did have to take out we had a couple posts in our fence line taken out, but fortunately it was a high tensile fence, and we were able to knock out those posts and pop the wire back up and electrify it in the short term until we could put some new posts in the ground. And it was only our alpaca that were in that field, and they are not major pushers on fences. So that was another positive for us. But we still have ponds that have metal sticking out of them. We know that there's metal from the tornado that's still there. What are we, almost 4 years later?
4 years. Yeah, and it's one of those things. I know with tornadoes, you can find metal in fields, they say, up to 20 years later. It's a continual, it's not just one and done. It's a continual challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is depending on where it is, getting it out is hard. Also, if it got stuck in the ground deep enough, getting it out, you need to have a large enough piece of equipment with enough strength to pull it back out of the ground. So all of those things are very tricky. It must be, I have a lot of empathy for people that are dealing with it right now, because I understand how overwhelming it can feel when it happens. And the one that I dealt with was much smaller in scale.
Yeah, it's just, they said that one that hit our Princeton research farm in the UK had a base that was about a mile wide at some point. And so that was just, a fairly large path of destruction. So you don't even have to be close to the farm to actually see the debris and encounter those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing when you think about a mile wide and how much damage that could be on a farm. I mean, it looks very different in a state where, farms are all 1,000 or 3,000 acres versus in states where the average farm size around here is around 100 and change acres. So you think about how many buildings could be impacted and how many families can be impacted on a mile wide stretch as it tears through.
And then I guess for you guys as well as also, just primarily, one of those challenges, just feeding the animals. Like you kind of mentioned a little earlier, feeding animals, getting animals taken care of. So you have all this other stuff going on. It's just feeding those animals.
Yeah, like nothing stops on the farm because the tornado happened. So all of the normal chores still occur every day regardless. But then you have on top of it all of those repairs and maintenance that you need to be doing, and the coordination with crews that are helping. It is really overwhelming to think about what it would look like right now for someone in some of these areas in Western Kentucky. For me, the one thing that I always wonder is, we were very lucky in the sense that it was a very small tornado, and we were able to get power back on to other areas of the farm that weren't damaged within hours. When you're talking about some of these larger tornadoes in some of these rural areas, the real focus, if they're trying to figure out how to get power back on these, the rural electrical cooperatives, their priority is to get power back on into the towns, into the areas where there's shelters, where there's food banks, where a lot of volunteers are working. where they're setting up their headquarters, their police stations, all of those things, getting power to those is absolutely priority, and it needs to be. But that means that if you're a farmer in a more rural area, you wait a long time for power to turn back on. And it's one of the reasons backup power, we talked about it last week, is so important, is because I can really see where if you weren't prepared, your job on the farm would also be harder. Yep. Typical chores would become harder, on top of which you have all of these other things happening at the same time. And prioritizing what you're going to do becomes overwhelming, probably.
It can definitely be, and I think that's where, some of this we have working with the Nunn Center, and then also I think there's going to be a booth with Wayne Sanderson, who's going to be at a booth at the farm show as well, just talking about the mental health aspects. It's going to be, because it is a very stressful event, and just helping you deal with that, just realizing that it is going to be stressful, but it is hopefully manageable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, we talk about the trauma for people that are living through it right now, and it is hard to process it, even if you're doing a really good job processing it, which, it took me a little while to process some of the stresses about it. It still is, it's so much over top of your head. It's like, when you ever see the cartoons with the big dark cloud over someone's head, that's what it probably feels like to a lot of people. Even if they're really understanding what's happening, there's still so much happening around them that they're really struggling to grasp the scale of all of this, I would imagine, and how much and how long they're going to be working at it. They're just trying to put one foot in front of the other for some of these folks, I would assume.
Because, and it's not just, for you, it's also, when this tornado happened, you also had the responsibilities here at work. So that day you also presented an extension presentation.
Yeah.
That day it was kind of like one of those, like, wow, you had this happen, and you kind of did a Zoom call. It's like, I'm not coming in because we had all this happen. You just did a Zoom call that day. I just remember, but there's still, you have your outside responsibilities as well. So it's definitely can be a challenge, it seems like.
Yeah, and you can't see at that point at least I couldn't see at that point exactly what needed to be the highest priority. You're treading water, you're figuring it out as you go along. What is the highest priority on this day or the next day? That's one of the reasons that talking to the leadership, I think, is going to be really interesting in these interviews, because some of these folks might not actively be dealing with the aftermath of it on a personal level, but they're dealing with it on a much broader scale, and recording some of that so that in the future we can make better decisions and have better standard operating procedures. To me, that's really the benefit of this. There's information here that can be gathered and be used to help more people in future natural disasters.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, even with talking to Ryan, it was eye-opening just to see, just how much they had outlined. They had like every step. It seemed like they had like three, like a short-term plan, immediate action plan, a short-term plan, then a long-term plan.
Yeah.
Of how do they address this response?
Yeah, and I think that what's going to be really interesting as we go through some more interviews is making sure that we see how different groups interact with each other, because, one of the most important things is that there's a lot of groups available that can provide support, and they all need to engage with each other as well as possible to give the most support as quickly as they can and as broadly as they can, and hopefully for as long as they can.
Right. That's one of the things we touched on as well, is just, this initial response, it's been great, but it's going to be a challenge for a number of years. And so, and even the immediate response of just having that, March and April planting season is coming up. And so how do you address all this debris? How do we move forward as effectively as possible? And I think that's one of the main challenges. And we'll try to get everyone's thought and see what is the best way to respond to some of these disasters.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that are interested, all of these will be available. All of these will be archived with the Louis B. Nunn Center. It is a specific project within that archive that everything will be sort of focused about those tornadoes, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some portions or complete interviews that we did as well here on our YouTube channel.
And we'll be in booth 3444 at the National Farm Machinery Show in the West Wing. And we'll have one of the trucks from the UK Princeton farm. It was just in essence, obliterated by this storm.
Yeah.
And just to give you a scope and scale of the damage, and just have some generator and some other stuff just to show our response.
Yeah, so we'll be focusing in the booth on both what the tornado did in terms of damage, just trying to give some visuals for people that weren't able to travel out there or haven't ever experienced a tornado before. But then we'll also have some material and information about storm shelters, backup power, those sorts of things that are probably really important for farms that are wanting to be prepared for any future natural disasters like these. And so we would be happy to speak with people there and look forward to that.
Yep. And I think, it's just, we'll have some of the FEMA material for storm shelters as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of those things. If you've never experienced one, your priority about climbing into a storm shelter is maybe a little different than if you lived through a tornado. I wouldn't have said I would have likely climbed into a small concrete box due to some issues with claustrophobia, but after
a tornado, it's like,
I would be far more likely to climb in if I think there's a chance that something is coming my way and I don't have a good basement to get into.
Fair enough.
Do you want to do a little update about what's happening in the next week or two, or do you want to just use the Farm Machinery Show as our major update for what we're going to be working on next week?
I think, we'll do some stuff on the farm. We'll do our basic feeding of hay, some repairs, but mainly it's going to be, we're spending next probably week at the National Farm Machinery Show down there in Louisville.
Yeah, Josh and I will both be spending a lot of time there, so our priorities on the farm are pretty much making sure animals get fed so that we can...
Animals get fed, checked, and then off to Louisville.
That's right. Yeah, that's my goal as well. The one thing we do have is we have a couple animals getting processed right now, and those steers will be coming back at the end of that week. So
okay,
but we'll talk about that when we come back after the Farm Machinery Show. We'll be off next week, and then we'll come back with a new post the following week. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have You Heard is a production of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, along with the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. Discover what's wildly possible at ca.uky.edu.